some kind of agonizing reappraisal of what America has to do and how they may coordinate with the Saudis in doing some of this?
Well, I think there was a real sense that the Saudis were angry, over the past several years. They wanted the United States to take out Bashar al-Assad in Syria, and we didn't. They feel that with the negotiations of Iran's nuclear program that we're essentially handing our policy to Iran. And they were already, for a long time, angry over the Iraq war, which they felt had essentially handed Iraq to Iran. So I think there's probably a desire to renew relationships now that you have a new king, to make the dialogue work better than it had in the past. And I think also probably there's a desire to see if the Saudis can be a little bit more flexible when dealing, for instance, with the problem like Yemen, where you have a kind of a religious, ideological opposition by the Saudis to the Houthis, which I would imagine that the Americans would urge the Saudis in a situation like this to think politics, to think more pragmatically. The leader of the Houthi movement, Abdul Malik al-Houthi, has actually, in his speeches, reached out and said, we'd like to work with everybody on this. We'd like dialogue. We'd like to come up with a solution. I don't know how genuine that is, but I would imagine that the Americans, if they can do anything right now, would like to do their best to urge the Saudis, who are by far the most powerful partner in that part of the world, to be as flexible as possible.
Though not on the same scale, the outcome in Libya is like the outcome in Iraq, damaging a broader foreign policy vision.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the Obama administration has put forward a vision of its policy in the region that is based on trying to influence, not dictate events, but try to influence events, go in with a small footprint rather than a large footprint, boots on the ground, and also be driven by certain humanitarian imperatives that I believe in very strongly with regard to the exercise of American power when we can do some good. It often requires a good deal of follow-up, though. And one of the things we see in a lot of these cases is that trying to put a state back together, to build basic institutions of a state, put aside democracy, just basic institutions of a state, is often a long-term project.
In places like Libya, a lot of those institutions were not there.
That's right. I mean, Colonel Gaddafi ran Libya for 4 decades, basically by deliberately trying to ensure that independent institutions that could operate without him didn't exist. And so you remove him and his immediate cronies, the state is going to collapse.
I was in Cairo during the revolution, and I visited Yemen shortly after President Saleh stepped down. And the one thing that struck me is when we're talking about 4 years ago, there was this brief moment of hope in which people's expectations were almost artificially inflated to the point where if we get rid of Gaddafi, if we get rid of Mubarak, if we get rid of Ali Abdullah Saleh, our countries will go back to the world, to the places that our grandparents used to tell us about when things worked, when we would go out our door and we would see a world in which we had hope. And what we've seen happen over the past 4 years is as those expectations were artificially inflated, they've now burst. And what's happened is in places like Yemen, in places like Libya, no one now knows the rules of the game. The rules are being rewritten because the people who made the rule book are gone and the rule book was thrown out. And so now everybody is scrambling to try to figure out what happens. And it's really, really messy and it's incredibly dangerous.
Often people say, the U.S. made a mistake in Libya or in Yemen by interfering too much or too little. I mean, given the chaos now in Libya, some people are saying, well, was it the right thing to have the NATO bombing campaign in the first place? I think it's easy to second-guess this stuff. I mean, people have argued that, in fact, it might have been possible to reach an agreement and to have a ceasefire, some negotiated transition with Libya. The Turks were trying to do that at the time. The Algerians were proposing that. Personally, I doubt it. I think the momentum was so great and that no Western leader was willing to step in and play the part of the cold realist and disappoint the hopes of all these revolutionaries. There was a feeling that you would have lost the Arab public if you did that. Chris Stevens, the ambassador who was killed in 2012, thought a lot about this. I knew him not well, but somewhat. And, he wanted to have a light footprint in the country. Ultimately, I don't know whether he was wrong or not, but we suffered perhaps for not having followed up closely enough. And yet, Chris didn't want a large American presence in that country. I think it's very hard to say whether the U.S. could have done better by whether in Libya or Syria, anywhere else, by intervening sooner. I think it's certainly very possible that we could have saved lives in Syria if the U.S. and its partners had been more aggressive and more imaginative with their diplomacy. But whether the U.S. could have changed the strategic picture on the ground, especially in Syria, where you have the Iranians who feel this is a life or death issue for them, where you have the Russians also backing Bashar al-Assad, I doubt that we could have made that big a difference.
Would we be better off if Gaddafi was in power in Libya?
You know, I hate to say yes. There might have been less loss of life, but certainly it's hard to imagine things can be much worse. I was in Tripoli in August 2011. And I remember seeing a huge warehouse full of weapons just on the outskirts of the city. There were shoulder-fired missiles. There was a football field-sized, just area full of bombs, of mortar shells, of tank shells. I went back to that same place a few days later, and much of it was gone. Those weapons are now in the Sinai Peninsula. They are all over Libya and who knows where else, in the Sahel. I mean, we have a whole region that is just on fire with insurgencies. On the other hand, I think it would have been hard to tamp all this down. I mean, you saw this tremendous, tremendous energy. And let's say, for instance, if the U.S. had not intervened, if there had not been a NATO intervention in 2011 in Libya, I think Libya at this point would probably look a lot like Syria. You would have had a civil war that would have lasted longer.
Probably with killing more people.
Probably so.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Robert Worth. Thank you, Matthew Waxman. Thank you, Gregory Johnsen. We'll revisit this, obviously. The specter of failed states, obviously, is one that's troubling Washington because they remember where al-Qaeda came from out of Afghanistan. So I thank each of you for being here. Thank you for joining us. See you next time.